Hi there, I'm Sergio III from Sergio III Films, and welcome to another episode of In the Frame. And today's episode is about Third Time's a Charm. This is films that are either the last part of a trilogy or the third part in a series that for me still stands up, and perhaps in some occasions is the best out of that trilogy or series. I mean, we all like to think that the first film is always the best film in a trilogy or a series, but it's not always the case. I just have a small number of films here, but again, I would really like you to give me your film that is the best as the third instalment of a trilogy or the third instalment in a series. With a few exceptions, these might not be objectively the best films in the series, but there's an argument to be made that they shouldn't just be dismissed because they're sequels or because they are, the third part of a 12-part series or something. So the first probably 4 for me, you could argue, are the best in the series, even though this video will be full of controversy. But again, this is an interactive channel, so I want you to tell me what your favourite part 3s are in trilogies or film series. So the first one is Exorcist 3, or Legion. You probably knew this would be in here, considering it was in my top 150. I've never been a huge fan of the original Exorcist. I think it's one of those films that you probably needed to see at the time, but I get its influence, I get its importance in film history. I don't actually have a copy. I probably should get a copy just for Max von Sydow, but I don't think it's aged well, perhaps because it's been parodied and ripped off so many times. So I think that kind of initial impact has lessened. Very much like Alien, I think it's one of those films that I wish I could go back and see in the cinema at the time. Obviously Mark Kermode, one of the critics that I actually have some respect for, he calls it the greatest film of all time, which is a little bit of a stretch, but again, it's subjective. But for me, The Exorcist 3 or Legion is the best Exorcist film, despite its many flaws. Written and directed by William Peter Blatty, who wrote The Exorcist. He wanted just to call it Legion and just dismiss The Exorcist 2, The Heretic. I know there's people out there that really love that film. Again, I haven't seen it for a long time, so I can't really speak on it. But The Exorcist 3 picks up with Detective Kinnaman, this time played by George C. Scott, not Lee J. Cobb, who had since passed. And this is more a brooding chiller about a serial killer, the Gemini killer, who, despite being executed some time ago, the killing seemed to have started in the exact same way the Gemini killer, and this leads George C. Scott to the disturbed ward in a local hospital where there's a patient who Kinnaman thinks is the trapped body of Father Karras, who was the priest who was killed in the first Exorcist film. Played by Brad Dourif. They were going to get Jason, what's his face? I seem to have completely forgotten his name now. Jason Miller, sorry, who played Father Karras in the first film, but he had drinking problems. The theatrical cut is a bit of a mess, because at some point the studio didn't want it to be called an Exorcist film because of Exorcist 2, but then at some point they changed their mind and went, no, let's call it The Exorcist 3 because we will make some money off the Exorcist name. But of course the script had no exorcism in it. It's about existential dread. It's really creepy, but there's no exorcism in it. Sorry. So the studio went, no, we need an exorcism. So they shot this exorcism with Nicol Williamson, who's just this random priest who then comes to perform an exorcism in the last scene. And there's snakes and fire, and it's just quite silly. But fortunately, Arrow and Scream Factory before them have the kind of director's cut, or as close to what William Peter Blatty wanted to actually put on the screen. So it's more Brad Dourif, who's brilliant, less Jason Miller, who had drinking problems during the time anyway and couldn't really perform. And yes, there's bits intercut on like bad VHS because that's the only existing material that was there. But the director's cut is far superior despite its flaws. It's a really creepy, disturbing film, one of the best kind of lull you to sleep then a jump scare. Kinnaman's relationship with his priest friend is just absolutely beautiful. The banter between the two of them is wonderful. It's just a great underappreciated film because of the shadow of The Exorcist, because of it's been a mess for a lot of years, but now the Arrow and Scream Factory have kind of as close to what the director wanted versions as possible. You can kind of see it for the really great flawed film that it is. Again, this Arrow release has a ton of special features. It's just an essential pickup. Yeah, The Exorcist 3 for me is the best Exorcist film. Next, again, another controversial one for me. It's Halloween 3 Season of the Witch. This is the Scream Factory edition. And for me, it's the best Halloween film. Again, the first one is it's good, I have it. But for me, Halloween 3 is the best Halloween film. And obviously fans were upset because Michael Myers isn't in it, but he is, because there's a clip of the original film that somebody's watching on TV. So Michael Myers is technically in it for like 10 seconds. The intention by Carpenter, who also didn't direct Halloween 3, Tommy Lee Wallace, one of his cohorts on the original Halloween, directed it, was to just make a Halloween story every year. But unfortunately, because they called it Halloween 3, people had expectations it was going to be a Michael Myers film, and of course it wasn't. And everybody hated it. They should have just called it Season of the Witch, and it would have been a lovely little chiller. It's a great wee film about killing children, which kind of gets overlooked, and it probably wouldn't get made now. It's about this witchcraft plot by a stone from Stonehenge that has magical powers. So when children put on their Halloween masks, a signal sent out with a really annoying tune. I've already done a random review, I think, so I won't sing it again. You'll be glad to know. And it turns their masks into snakes and bugs and kills them. So for like a mainstream film whose basic premise is the murdering of thousands of children, amazingly it got made. It's shot by Dean Cundy, so it has that Carpenter look. Carpenter and Alan Howarth did the music, so it has that Carpenter feel, even though it's not actually a Carpenter film. He just produced it, obviously. But it's so good. Tom Atkins, who we don't really believe is a doctor, plays a doctor who gets involved in investigating this mask factory because somebody's father has died, so he gets embroiled by following this young woman because he's a bit of a horn dog. I mean, he spends most of the film slapping nurses in the ass and stuff like that. He's a lady magnet or a sex pest, depending on which way you look at it. It's actually quite gory. There's some really nasty kind of deaths in it. It's just a wonderful little film that for me is the best Halloween film, even though fans of the franchise would say it's not actually a Halloween film. The kind of town that the factory is in is called Santa Mira, which is the same name of the town in the original Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which is a nice little touch. The ending has echoes of Invasion of the Body Snatchers as well. It's just such a fun little film. I actually watched it on Halloween. And again, for me, it's the third Halloween film, but it's the best. Next, I don't think anybody would dispute this part 3 is the best of the trilogy. Sergio Leone's Good, Bad and Ugly. I mean, it's a flat masterpiece. A Fistful of Dollars is a good film. I don't really watch it that much, if I'm being honest, because you're Jimbo. For a few dollars more, again, is a step up. You see Leone's kind of trademarks appearing, and then The Good, the Bad and Ugly just blows the first two films out of the water. For a long time it was my favourite western of all time. It was one of my favourite films of all time, it still is. But then I saw Once Upon a Time in the West, which is just marginally better than The Good, Bad and Ugly. Even though I've probably seen The Good, Bad and Ugly about 50 times. Again, it's another example of how to do a long film short. Granted, when they went back and added extra scenes, a couple of them don't really add much to it. But it's just a wonderful film. Great score by Morricone, of course. And easily the best of that trilogy, proving that the last part of a trilogy can also be the best. I'm not going to talk too much about The Good, the Bad and Ugly because we'll be here all day. Again, it has the best relationship between those three men who would easily shoot each other in the back if they had the chance, but they also have respect for each other. The whole morbid, sadistic dance of death that the three of them do, it's just wonderful. The fact that, again, it takes like 45 minutes just to get the story started, but you're absolutely riveted. And directors could learn how to make a long film seem short. So next is the last part in the Colours trilogy by Kieślowski, Three Colours Red. For a long time this was my favourite of the trilogy. This was the one I actually saw first. I mean, you don't have to see the trilogy in order, but it blew me away. I would say probably blue is my favourite now, just by a touch over red, then white. But again, don't really need to say too much about it. It's one of Kieślowski's masterpieces. Irene Jacob and Jean-Louis Trintignant as a judge, juge. It's just beautiful. Preisner's music. It's about fate and life, and it's a masterpiece. And another example of the third film in a trilogy or a series can be awesome. The next are two animated ones that, again, objectively, the series perhaps aren't the greatest, but I have a soft spot for them. That's How to Train Your Dragon 3, The Hidden World, even though they didn't obviously call it 3. Again, I just love this series. Again, objectively, is it the best animated series of all time? No, it's not, but it's just so much fun. Again, Toothless the Dragon finds a mate. They find a hidden world. It's just awesome. Again, for me, there's not much difference between 1, 2 and 3 as far as quality. They're all just really enjoyable. In the same Kung Fu Panda 3. Again, I'm not a huge Jack Black fan. I think these are the only Jack Black films that I have. Again, I think the thing that makes these films work is the villains are good. You had the Snow Leopard in the first one. You had Gary Oldman's. Is it a swan? Not sure whether he's a swan. He was some long-necked bird. And then we have this magical ox, Kai. Yes, this one's a bit more schmaltzy. But again, I just enjoy these. They look stunning. So objectively I can say, these aren't, masterpieces like the first bunch we saw, but they're just so much fun and really enjoyable series, really enjoyable trilogies for me. But then I'm weird. Next up is John Wick 3. Again, I think these films are overhyped. They're not masterpieces or anything. But for me, the second one was a bit disappointing. And I didn't watch the third one. I didn't see the third one for a long time just because the second one for me was just... It just became a bit dull and repetitive. But part 3 really bounced back. I think with additional Lance Reddick getting more involved, with the kind of female auditor character that turned up. It was just different dynamics and just made it a little bit more interesting than the second one, which just for me was just a little bit dull. Halle Berry turns up as well, so it's just a bit more varied. Overall, it's a fun trilogy, but again, some people treat it as some great masterpiece trilogy or something. They're just good fun action films, but the third one for me really kind of stood up, and you could actually argue it's the best of the series. I mean, the first one is good, but it was kind of let down in the third act, I think. But they're all fun, but the third one is well worth your time. Next, back to a little bit art house, and it's Saijit Ray's Apu Sansar, or the World of Apu, the final film in his Apu trilogy. And again, you can make the argument that this is the best one out of the three, but again, they're all of such high quality. This is from 1959. This is Apu, played by Sumitra Chatterjee, of course, who played so many characters in Ray films. As he becomes a man and grows up and kind of accidentally gets married and has a kid and becomes a father. Beautiful film, beautiful cinematography, great characters that you root for and want to get to know and follow the story, and a fitting end to that trilogy. Next, the complete opposite, House 3, the horror show. Again, another film that originally was just released as a horror show because they wanted to get away from the House franchise, but then it's kind of come back into the fold as a House film. This is not a great film, but again, you can make the argument it's the best one out of the series, mainly because it's got Lance Henriksen and Brian James, and Brian James comes back from the dead as Meat Cleaver Max, a serial killer who Lance Henriksen's put away. It's cheesy nonsense, directed by the guy who did Jason X, so that gives you an idea of the quality of it. Yeah, it's daft fun, but it's an example of when you've got two interesting leads, you can make a film that's daft fun. Two other leads other than Henriksen and James, it would probably be a bit of a different story. Next is the last part of the Vengeance trilogy, Lady Vengeance. by Park Chan-wook. You could argue this is the best of the series. Again, Old Boy kind of gets all the publicity, but I think Lady Vengeance might actually be the better film, objectively. About a woman in prison for a crime she didn't commit. It's bad old Choi Min-sik again. And she comes out of prison, a reformed character, becoming a Christian and all of that, but in actual fact she's plotting her revenge. Beautiful film. This Arrow, which came in the Arrow box set, has the theatrical version and the fade to black and white version. There's commentaries. Yeah, I think in the passage of time, I think Lady Vengeance is actually the best film out of the trilogy, but also this was the last one in the trilogy. Let me know in the comments if you agree or disagree. Next is Tokyo Story by Ozu, which is the last in the Noriko trilogy. Again, I'll be the first to admit, I have not seen a lot of Ozu. I've only seen Tokyo Story in late spring, both of which are 5-star films. I have a bunch of these films in my backlog, all from BFI. This is one of the best films about family and parenthood and children's attitude to their parents when they get older. We all know that. But it's Ozu's simple framing. He's a little bit like Ray in the sense these films are kind of deceptively simple on the surface, but there's kind of more going on underneath. And this is the third part of the Noriko trilogy, which I wasn't really aware of until I looked it up. So Tokyo Story counts as a part 3. Next is Alien 3. Now Alien 3 is interesting because obviously when it came out everybody hated it because they killed Ripley and other reasons. I actually really liked it. It's a rare example of, there's two cuts of the film, the theatrical and not the director's cut, kind of just a studio assembly cut, and it's a rare example where not the director's cut, because David Fincher disowned it, but the studio assembly cut's actually way better than the theatrical. It adds about 35 minutes or so. It just makes much more narrative sense, and there's much more Charles Dance in it. Because, spoiler alert, in the theatrical trailer when Charles Dance dies, you're genuinely upset, because again Ripley and him have a bond, whereas in the studio cut there's more of Charles Dance, which is a good thing because Charles Dance is awesome. And is it better? Is it a better film than the first two? Objectively, probably not. But the reason I've put it on the list is it's probably the Alien film that I watch the most now. I don't really watch, because for me, with Alien and Aliens, once the supporting cast all get knocked off, the films don't seem quite as interesting. It's a similar thing to Predator in actual fact. I love Predator, but once the supporting cast go and it's just Arnie and the Predator, it's just not as interesting. And I find that with the first two Alien films. But I do have a real soft spot for Alien 3, and it might actually be my favourite now out of the 4 films. I would highly recommend the studio assembly cut if you've never seen it. If you're just used to the theatrical cut, there's a whole thing with Paul McGann letting it out after they capture it, which in the theatrical cut's not really explained and doesn't really make sense. It's just that it got out again, whereas the studio assembly cut, you kind of understand how it got out. And again, more Charles Dance. And the final entry it's a bit of a cheat because it's really just one film, but it's The Human Condition Part 3, A Soldier's Prayer. Now granted, The Human Condition is just one film essentially, but I'm going to cheat and say that Part 3 is monumental, and is as much of a masterpiece as Part 1 and 2. I would say Part 1 perhaps isn't a masterpiece. Part 2 and 3 are, and overall it is, if you take it as one film. This is, the end of his journey. Kaji, it's a stunner. It just puts a wonderful cap on an amazing piece of work, and I'm counting it as part 3 in a series or in a trilogy, so that's why it's on the list. So there'll be plenty more. I haven't seen all the Before After Sunset trilogy by Linklater. I haven't seen the Coker trilogy. There's plenty of other trilogies. I haven't seen all of the Ashes and Diamonds trilogy. So there's plenty of trilogies I haven't seen. So please let me know in the comments which are your favourite part 3s, proving that third time sometimes can be a charm. So thanks very much for watching this episode of In the Frame. Hopefully you'll join me in the future for more. This is Sergio III from Sergio III Films saying thanks for watching and farewell.